Today I will go through the passage of Jesus and his temptations in the wilderness in Matthew 4:1-11 to explore the rhetorical tools used in biblical interpretation and hopefully to show that the author's intent, his audience, and the historical and cultural context are the most important tools for good biblical interpretation. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, let's look at the author. The author is Matthew, who is one of the disciples of Jesus and also a former tax collector. He is a Jewish Christian. Similarly, his audience are also Jewish Christians. We can tell this because of the vast usage of Old Testament scriptures and references, which only Jewish people would fully understand and appreciate. This leads into our author's purpose, which is that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. Through his life, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension, he has inaugurated the kingdom of heaven, and he rules over that with full authority. This should be hope for the Jewish Christians who are living in a world that is getting more and more hostile towards them. With this background, we can look into the historical and cultural context, which is most importantly, Jesus' testing is a parallel to Israel's testing in the past. So Israel in the past wandered 40 years in the desert before they entered the promised land, and this was a time of testing for them. Deuteronomy 8:2 summarizes this pretty well. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. So in the same way that Israel was tested, Jesus is also being tested in this story. He is humbled and he is being tested to show what is in his heart, whether or not he would follow God's commands, whether or not he was worthy of being the Messiah and fulfilling the messianic task. So with this context, we can go into the analysis. So let's look at the first temptation. Satan asked Jesus to turn a stone into bread to satisfy his hunger. Jesus responds with Deuteronomy 8:3. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word from the mouth of the Lord. So this is the first parallel that we see back to Israel. In the past, Israel was hungry in the desert, and they begged God for food, and God was teaching them dependence through that hunger on himself. But the Israelites grumbled and they failed. But this case, Jesus did not. Jesus held strong and put his faith in God, and he succeeded. So for the first time, Jesus succeeded where Israel failed. Now let's look at the second temptation. Satan takes Jesus up to the temple and tells him to jump off, saying that God has promised that he won't let the ones he loves to be hurt, that he will send angels to protect you. And Jesus responds with Deuteronomy 6:16, do not test the Lord your God. And again, this is another parallel back to Israel. In the past, Israel was at Massah, and they tested the Lord by grumbling for water. So for the second time, Jesus has succeeded where Israel has failed in the past. And now finally, let's look at the third temptation. Satan asks Jesus to bow down to him, and he will give him authority over all the kingdoms of the earth. Jesus responds with Deuteronomy 6:13, worship the Lord your God only. And for the third and final time, Jesus succeeds where Israel failed in the past, where Israel bowed down to the golden calf. So hopefully, through this analysis and interpretation, you can see the importance of these rhetorical tools. First, this historical context. If we don't understand the parallels between Jesus and Israel, we miss completely the meaning of this passage and this story. Without the audience, we cannot see that this historical context is applicable because only Jewish Christians would understand this history and understand its importance. And finally, the passage harkens back to that original intent of Matthew in the gospel to show that the Messiah is Jesus, that he is king, that he is worthy, and that he has done everything for us, and that he is God's anointed. So I believe that these rhetorical tools aren't just for this passage, but can be used for all biblical interpretation. And I hopefully have shown you guys that this is important.